Section 10.8 introduce complex number. We understand that radical 9 is 3. But if you have a negative number under the radical, is undefined. Like if you use your calculator and take a square root of -9, the calculator would give you error. Because you cannot, if the root of radical is positive and is even number, you cannot have the negative number under. If you have a negative number, then it's undefined. You don't get any real solution. But here we introduce a new definition that anywhere that you have radical -1, you could write that as I, a complex number. And just a vector, we don't have to go through that, but just for informations, this vector has X and Y. And it's A plus BI. Anyway, so radical -1 is always equal to I. So in that case, if I have radical -9, what I can do is I can write it as radical 9 times radical -1. You could break it into two radicals, but then this one is 3, and according to this definition, that one is I. So you have 3I. What is radical -4? It's radical 4 times radical -1, or 2I, because this is I. Okay. And what is I times I? Means radical -1 times radical -1, which is -1. So I is radical -1, but I2 is -1. You need to remember this too. Anywhere you see I is radical -1, but I2 is -1. So for that, here you have a bunch of problems here. Radical -16 is radical 16 IY, because you have radical 16 times radical -1, which is 4, and this one is I. So I is radical -1. Okay. Now, we need to subtract these two complex numbers. Again, complex number is A plus BI. So you have two of them. You want to subtract. So it's 6 minus I, and then I distribute the negative. Now, I are like log terms. See, how many I do I have? -1 and -7 is -8. And the numbers are -3. So you treat them as a log terms. Like here. I don't need a parenthesis here because there is just a positive sign. But this negative change everything here. But look, these two are log terms. -7I and -2I is -9I. And -9, -3 is -12. What if I multiply these two? Look, -5I times 2I is like 5A times 2A. -5 times 2 is -10. And what is I times I? Remember, I2. And we said I2 is always -1. So I is radical -1, and I2 is -1. I is radical -1, and I2 is negative. We want to multiply these two. First, we need to move the negative out. So when you move the negative out, you put I here. You take the negative out, you put I here. Radical 81 is 9, so you have 9I times 2I. See, 18I2, or 18 times -1 is 18, -18. So anytime you move the negative out of the radical, you gotta put the I next to it. See, radical negative 4 now is radical 4i, because when you move the negative, you have to put I. Same thing here. Radical minus 10 is 10 radical 10i. Radical minus 7 is 7i. When you multiply, is radical 70 I2. I2 is negative 1, so it's minus 70. Multiplications, you distribute. See? Anywhere you see I2, you put negative 1. Don't substitute I, because I is radical. I2 is a negative 1. But I, you don't substitute I. You just remain as I. And the rest is all very similar to multiplication of the variable. See? It's very similar to like 2 plus 5x times 5 plus x. The only difference is here, anytime you see a I2, you put the negative 1 here. So positive 5 I2 now is minus 5, see? Because I2 is negative, times positive 5 is negative 5. Anywhere you see I2 is a negative 1, okay? So minus 9 I2 is positive 9. Now, when we ask you to divide and simplify, this is the equations. Number 10. See number 10? It said divide and simplify. This is your original one. 89 over 8 plus 5i. This is very similar to rationalizing the denominator. You don't want to have I at the denominator. So what do? Multiply by the same one with the opposite sign, conjugate, remember? It's very similar to that rationalizing denominator with the radical. Then when if you have a plus 5i, then you multiply by a minus 5i. Now, of course, you put the same thing at the top. Now, when you multiply these two, it's 64 minus 25i2. But since i2 is negative 1, then you have positive 25. And then the numerator is just whatever it is. And then you break it to write it like that. Why? Because you always want to have a plus bi. So you cannot leave it like that. You have to break it and write it like this. You always have a number and a number next to I. See? A plus bi. So the final format must be in this form. See, I want to rationalize, so multiply by 7 plus 4i. See, I don't have I at the denominator anymore. But then at the end, you break it to look like that. bi plus a or a, it doesn't matter what is the same thing. bi plus a is the same thing. Okay. Now, if you just have I, just I, multiplied by I, because I times I is I2, which is negative 1, okay? So remember, when you had 1 over radical x, remember we just multiply this by radical x and radical x to make it x here. Same thing here. If you have 1 over I, you multiply by I over I. Because at the top you have I, at the bottom you have I2, which is negative 1. Very similar to that rationalizing. Or in the rationalizing, if remember, if you had like radical x minus like radical y, you multiply that by radical x plus radical y and radical x plus radical y. So this two would be just the x minus y. Same thing here. If I have like 5 minus 9i, I multiply by what? By 5 plus 9i here and 5 plus 9i here. Because now these two will give me 25 minus 81 I2. but I2 is a -1, so you finally have 25 plus 81 or 106. See, you don't have any I at the denominator. So it's very similar to that. As you see here. 3 multiplied by 5 plus 9. Now, how do I simplify I to power of 12? You know, I to power of 12, you could write it as I2, the whole thing to power of 6. Remember, if you have more than one exponent, you always multiply the exponent. You could also do it backward, means you could break the exponent. Like here, we break, you know, we broke this into 2 and 6. Why? Because now I2 is -1. And what is -1 to power of even? 1. 19. You write this as I to power 18 times I. Then I18, you break the 18 into 2 and 9. Then I2 is -1. So -1 to power of 9 is -1 times I. I10, again, break the 10 into 2 and 5. I2 is -1 to power of 5 is -1, so forth. So when you have an odd number like this and that, try to write it as even and I. And this part you could work on it. You could just write I2 and then -1 to power, stuff like that. Okay. Same thing we did here. I2 is -1. 24, you write it as that. Okay, so that end of chapter. What chapter was it? Chapter 10.